This happened to me recently while I was sorting through old family documents in a dusty attic. Among faded photographs and stacks of letters, I discovered a small leather diary with a worn cover and barely legible initials. Flipping through its yellowed pages, I initially thought these were some work records or perhaps accounting ledgers. But as I read on, I realized these entries recount the eerie events that befell one of my distant ancestors in 1905. I don't recall anyone in the family ever mentioning this, and what I read sent chills down my spine. Determining that this story must not be allowed to fade into oblivion, I am publishing it exactly as it appears in the diary. In 1905, I was working as an assistant for a large cattle rancher in Texas. His land stretched far and wide, and no one in the area could match the size of his herd. Hundreds, sometimes even thousands of heads of cattle spread out over pastures and barren tracts. The owner's house was located right at the center of his holdings and resembled a small mansion with a wide veranda and heavy wooden doors. I lived on the ranch helping with the day-to-day operations, taking care of the horses, tending to the pens and fences, and often keeping track of both the cattle and the supplies. The owner was a solid, strict but fair man. He paid well and tolerated no laziness. He frequently traveled into town on business, leaving me in charge. It was my duty to ensure that everything was running smoothly. If a fence had fallen into disrepair, it needed immediate repair. If an animal got sick, either find a doctor or decide what to do myself. The workday began before dawn, feeding and watering the animals, inspecting the pastures. Yet, I was content. Around these parts, it was considered a good wage, and I enjoyed the constant motion of life out here. One day, the owner returned from a fair and announced that he had sold a large shipment of cattle, 1,500 bulls and 500 young, not yet milking cows, and that they now needed to be driven to the neighboring state. Such a volume couldn't be moved single-handedly, which meant hiring cowboys, stocking up on water and provisions, and carefully planning our route. I realized the task would be a tough one, but the owner made no bones about it. Everything had to be done as quickly as possible. The buyer was waiting, and the profits promised a handsome return. I quickly estimated that we'd need about 10 to 15 cowboys, depending on their experience. Some of our men were already working with us, while a few had to be recruited from neighboring ranches. Young fellows who weren't afraid of dust or the hard life out here. Cowboys are a hardy bunch, accustomed to grueling treks, sleeping under the open sky, and risking encounters with wild animals or bandits. Even before our departure, we inspected the horses to ensure each one was healthy and well shod, and we prepared all the necessary equipment and weapons. I figured that if everything went smoothly, we could complete the drive in a week. At that moment, I had no idea what ordeals awaited me and everyone who dared to embark on this cattle drive. We had virtually no options for the route. Either take a detour nearly twice as long or force our way through barren lands teeming with venomous snakes, wild beasts, and perhaps the most scorching heat in all of Texas. We chose the latter, deciding that saving time justified the risk. The ranch owner approved of this decision. He said that it would get the job done faster, saving money on roads and feed. We prepared meticulously. I made sure each cowboy had enough ammunition. In those days, setting out on such a journey unarmed was pure madness. We took revolvers and carbines. Some even grabbed a rifle of a larger caliber. You never knew what might happen on the trail. Robbers or a large wild animal, perhaps. Then we turned our attention to stocking up on water and provisions. We pre-salted some meat, loaded wagons with sacks of beans and cornmeal, and hitched several barrels for water. I knew that if we couldn't find a proper stream or well for too long, both we and the horses would suffer. Before setting off, we had to separate the 2,000 heads of cattle, both bulls and cows. It took 2 days to round up the designated animals from the pastures, drive them into pens, and sort them so they wouldn't get mixed up. The dogs helped herd the bulls, which were always trying to break free, and the cowboys cursed as they had to catch those that had strayed from the main group. By evening, the men were exhausted, but progress was being made. After we finished segregating and counting the livestock, we turned to the final preparations. We re-inspected the saddles, reinforced the horses' horseshoes, and checked the leather halters and stirrups. After all, in the heat, leather cracks quickly. We packed gunpowder and ammunition. Some even brought along hunting knives. We gathered several dozen ropes. Without them, handling such a massive herd would have been impossible. We fed the dogs and checked them too, making sure they had no injuries. On the second night, everyone went to bed early so that we could set out at dawn, before the merciless sun rose high. The day of departure finally came. The horses impatiently stampeded, and the cattle grumbled as they kicked up dust from beneath their hooves. We opened the pens, releasing that powerful, living wave, 1,000 bulls and 500 cows that were to be delivered to the neighboring state. The cowboys spread out in a semicircle around the herd, each armed. I positioned myself a little ahead to direct the movement, while 2 of the most experienced cowboys stayed back to keep watch and make sure no one lagged behind. The sun rose quickly, and we had to stop for a brief rest so that the animals could catch their breath. Even then, I could feel the tension. I'd heard from old-timers that the desert likes to play tricks on strangers, but no one showed any outward signs of worry. Everyone knew the work would be hard, yet familiar. After all, this wasn't our first time driving cattle across Texas. None of us suspected that an altogether darker, far more ominous experience lay ahead. For the first 2 days, we made our way through semi-desert stretches where only a few scraggly bushes dotted the landscape, and on occasion we encountered a parched little stream. We moved slowly, careful not to overburden the animals or deplete our strength too quickly. In the evenings, we looked for places to camp. Any slight rise that might shield us from the wind and offer at least a hint of water. Our routine was as follows. First, we positioned the horses, then we set up small, portable fences so the cows wouldn't scatter during the night. We built fires from whatever we could find. Dry, prickly branches, twigs. Sometimes even someone would bring dried manure just to get something burning. We prepared a simple meal: beans, corn tortillas, and a bit of jerky. In the evenings, the cowboys spoke quietly, reminiscing about where they were from, the adventures they'd had, and the tall tales they'd heard about these places. I heard mentions of various supernatural occurrences, ghostly lights, or even entire caravans vanishing in some remote canyon, but no one spoke of it loudly, as if afraid to tempt fate. Personally, I preferred to think that any disappearances were the work of local bandits or the wild itself. At night, we set up guards, rotating every couple of hours. Whoever was on watch would patrol the perimeter of the herd with a lantern and his weapon, listening for the wild howls of coyotes. A couple of times we heard the sound of a snake rustling across the sand nearby, but none ever slithered into camp. The horses, of course, got nervous and might suddenly whinny at the top of their lungs, startling the entire group. In any case, no serious incidents occurred, except for one cowboy who swore he saw a black figure riding a horse on the horizon. But it vanished in the haze before he could alert anyone. I chalked it up to a mirage. By the end of the second day, everyone was tired, but they kept up their spirits. A cattle drive was just a part of the job, albeit a hard one. Toward evening, we noticed that the dogs sometimes stared toward the barren hills, growling, though nothing could be seen. I tried to dismiss the uneasy thoughts. The desert is vast, full of rustling sounds and shifting shadows, and an exhausted mind can easily mistake a swaying bush for someone lurking nearby. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was tracking us, moving along our trail just a little too close. At dawn on the third day, we rose early and set off again, hoping to pass through the most dangerous areas before nightfall. On the third day, trouble struck around noon. One of the cows suddenly began mooing loudly, drawing up her hind leg and trying to lie down in the sand. The cowboys rushed over and saw a swollen bite on her udder, clearly from a snake. Rattlesnakes roamed these parts. Their venom was potent, and we had no antivenom. Moreover, dragging a sick animal through the desert for several more days made no sense. It would either die a slow, painful death, or become an easy target for predators, all while slowing down the entire column. We had to make a tough decision: euthanize the cow and butcher it for meat. I ordered that part of the meat be salted to preserve it, while the rest was to be roasted over a fire. It was heartbreaking to see an entire animal go like that, but we had no other choice. Late in the evening, as the campfires were nearly dying down and the men, having eaten, were quietly conversing, we heard a howl. It came from somewhere in the distance and was so drawn out that it sent a chill through me. It sounded either like a wolf's howl or something even more ominous. One of the cowboys suggested it might be coyotes, but the howl was far too menacing even for them. Conversations began about all sorts of nocturnal creatures that no one had ever seen but supposedly heard. I ordered an extra watch for the night. The dogs seemed to sense that something was amiss and prowled restlessly around the camp. That night we barely slept. We were all ready to spring up at the slightest sound. But aside from muffled barking and the wind slapping sand into our faces, nothing happened. In the morning, everyone was on edge, as if we were being tested for our mettle. So far, we'd only suffered minor losses, but the atmosphere was growing increasingly oppressive. On the fourth day, we continued on under the blazing sun. We traveled for half a day without incident, but in the sweltering midday heat, one of the cowboys came up to me and said he'd seen 2 pumas on some rocks. I understood that mountain lions did indeed hunt in these parts. They rarely attacked large herds, but a lagging or injured animal could become their prey. We remained alert, checking our water flasks and our weapons, hoping the predators would steer clear. By evening, we chose a spot to camp near a low, rocky ridge. We built our fires, herded the cows and bulls into makeshift pens, and tied up the horses. As dusk fell over the desert, a stifling silence set in. The weary cowboys managed a meager dinner, lit a couple more fires for safety, and began to settle down. I was half asleep when I suddenly heard an anxious bark from the dogs, followed by a deafening bellow from the cattle. I leapt up, grabbed my rifle, and rushed toward where a light was already blazing, a torch perhaps, revealing 2 pumas that had leaped onto the herd, apparently targeting a heifer or a weakened cow. One of them, growling, tried to bite through the animal's neck while the other darted between the bull's legs. The cowboys fired their revolvers and the dogs lunged into the fray. In the wild dust and the chaotic shouts, it was hard to see clearly. Eventually, one of the pumas was hit by a bullet and recoiled into the darkness, and the other, it seemed, was also wounded before it vanished. But they had managed to kill one cow and maim another so badly that it had to be put down. The livestock fell into a panic. The bulls bellowed loudly, trying to break through the enclosures, and the calves scattered in every direction. We spent half an hour trying to calm everyone down. One cowboy burned his hand and another injured his shoulder while dragging a frightened bull. That night passed almost sleeplessly. The three of us stood guard while the dogs patrolled the perimeter of the camp. A couple of times it felt as if someone was watching us from the darkness, but we found no trace of anyone. At dawn the next day, we drove the herd further, hoping that the desert would finally ease its temperament. However, a far more horrifying discovery awaited us. It's hard to describe how the scorching sun drains not only the body, but also the soul. It seemed we had grown accustomed to the constant itch from the dust, to the fact that the water in our flasks warmed by noon, and to the nervous expectation of impending trouble that had become our constant companion. That day the heat was unbearable, and the ground shimmered in a haze. By lunchtime, we made a stop so the cows could drink and we could catch a brief rest. As we moved on, I noticed that the animals were suddenly behaving strangely. They seemed to deliberately avoid a small depression we were about to cross. As I drew nearer, I saw that there were stones arranged in a perfect circle. The stones were roughly hewn and covered with what looked like carved symbols, or perhaps natural cracks. But it seemed as though someone had deliberately etched these markings. The cows outright refused to cross the boundary of the circle, even though there was no fence or natural barrier around it. I felt an unsettling prickling inside, as if warning me, "Don't go there." But curiosity and the need to press on won out. We began to steer the herd around the circle, and at that moment one of the cows, a young, stubborn yet apparently more timid one, suddenly bolted and fell into a pit about 10 meters from the stone circle. It all happened so quickly that we couldn't stop it in time. I and my men rushed over to assess the situation. It turned out that the ground had collapsed right under the poor animal's hooves, trapping it in the depression, and below was an opening that looked like the entrance to a cave. Some of the cowboys suggested leaving the cow, saying it wasn't the time for a rescue operation when chaos was already unfolding around us. But we knew that this was a purebred animal, and it would be a shame to abandon it to a slow, certain death in the desert. I ordered that ropes be secured and that we carefully descend to the cow so as not to cause further collapse of the pit's edges. From below wafted a musty, rotten smell. It's hard to describe exactly what lay at the bottom, but I got the impression that something alive was down there, something that had long awaited unexpected visitors. I decided to descend into the pit myself, feeling responsible as the leader of the cattle drive. I carefully lowered myself, trying not to slip on the crumbling ground. When I reached the bottom, I saw that the cow had struck a ledge hard and was limping, but it would likely survive if we could pull it out in time. In the shadows around, there was an opening leading into an underground chamber. At first glance, the cave descended further down. The smell there was even stronger, a mix of putrid water and decay, with a sharp note reminiscent of old, burnt wool. One of our men, a young fellow named Tom, who was up above, suddenly volunteered to check what was inside the cave. I waved him off, saying, "We're not here for adventures. We're here to rescue the cow." But he had already descended by rope, carrying a kerosene lamp with him, intent on taking a few steps into the crevasse to see if there was any danger. I didn't encourage him, yet I couldn't argue at that moment. My hands were busy securing the ropes to the cow. I then ordered the other cowboys to pull the cow upward, while I remained in the pit to support the animal as it was slowly hauled out. Meanwhile, Tom disappeared from sight around a bend in the cave. It was dark down there, and the echo of dripping water, perhaps pooled at the bottom, could be heard. I was about to call out for him to come back when I suddenly heard a short scream from him. Then came a deep, resonant sound, as if something heavy had stirred in the depths. My heart sank. For a moment it became so silent that I could only hear my own breathing and, from above, the hoarse bellow of the frightened cow. I called out to Tom, but he didn't respond. The seconds dragged by painfully. Finally, hurried footsteps reached me. A moment later, the boy appeared from around the bend. His face was as white as chalk, and raw terror shone in his eyes. Without a word, he ran to the rope and climbed back up. I glanced toward the cave, and in the distance, something black and slick flashed by, seemingly moving back into the depths. We managed to haul the cow out with difficulty and loaded it into the wagon. Up top, the cowboys swarmed around Tom, demanding to know what had happened. He was trembling so badly that he could barely hold his lamp, babbling that he had seen something huge and hideous, like a figure straight out of ancient superstitious carvings. I didn't press him for details. I only glanced into his eyes, which were filled with such terror that everything was clear to me. It seemed that something dwelled inside the cave that we no longer wished to know about. One thing was certain: we couldn't afford to linger near that ritual circle and the cave. We gathered everyone, managed to haul the injured cow far away, and then drove the herd along a detour. A sick feeling settled over me, as if we had been warned. You have trespassed into lands that aren't yours. I found myself thinking that I didn't want to spend a night anywhere near that cursed place. So I decided to push the animals forward until the sun sank below the horizon. No one objected. Everyone was terrified, especially Tom, who sat in the wagon silently shaking. Ever since, the odor emanating from the cave has seared itself into my memory, nauseating and cold, as though drawn from death itself in those underground depths. We marched through the entire second half of the day without stopping, even though the animals could barely move their hooves. Not a single cowboy mentioned taking a break. Everyone felt we had to get as far away as possible from that accursed ritual circle. When darkness finally fell completely, we chose a spot on a small rise near a stand of dried-out scrub. There we set up camp, arranging the horses, constructing a pen for the herd, and putting the dogs on watch. After what had happened in the cave, Tom was not himself at all. He kept silent and flinched at every sudden sound. I knew the young man was deeply frightened and did not insist that he stand guard during the night. Let him rest, if he could even sleep after that ordeal. The other cowboys eyed him warily, as if afraid that he had witnessed something capable of wrecking our entire trip. By midnight, some of us had already dozed off by the campfires, accustomed to the soft rustling of the wind. But I felt that calm was not to be expected. That kind of tension usually comes before a heavy storm, even though the sky appeared clear, with only a few clouds drifting in the moonlight. Still, we maintained our watch in pairs, patrolling the camp's perimeter and keeping an eye on the herd. The cows were nervous, frequently mooing and huddling together, and the horses would sometimes stamp their hooves and snort at shifting shadows. At dawn, when the sky was just beginning to turn gray, sharp sounds rang out from the far end of the camp, either a gunshot or a scream. I grabbed my carbine and ran toward the noise. My men were already galloping on their horses or running, some in boots, others barely pulling up their trousers. It soon became clear that several cows had been attacked. Two lay torn apart as if shredded by claws and teeth of enormous predators. But I had never seen such beasts before. The tracks were strange, as if made by a wolf or a large cat, yet the shape of the footprints didn't match any animal we knew. The cowboy on watch was as pale as a sheet. He said he'd first heard a terrible roar and mooing, and when he ran over he found dead animals, and caught a glimpse of something unnaturally large disappearing into the bushes. Under the stress, He fired blindly into the darkness. We found no other traces except for bloodstains and several sets of odd footprints. One of the cowboys even suspected that the creature moved either on 2 legs or on 4, leaving behind ambiguous marks. I couldn't fathom what kind of creature prowled at night. Pumas don't leave such carnage, and wolves are rare here, not to mention that they certainly don't attack a couple of cows in minutes. A sick feeling told me that these events were connected to that ominous circle of stones in the cave. But what was the point of debating it when we still had to move on? I announced that we needed to clean up, to either bury the remains or haul them away, so as not to attract more scavengers to the camp or incite panic among the herd. On a foggy morning, we gathered ourselves, skipping a proper breakfast, and set off again. Although Tom had turned pale, he still got back on his saddle, though he rode at the rear, trying not to look around. It seemed that everyone was gripped by a sticky fear. We had to move the herd as quickly as possible. I sensed that the mounting tension might erupt into something even worse if we lingered here for days or weeks. Even the cattle seemed to sense the nervous atmosphere. The bulls frequently glanced around, and some cows balked at the slightest shadow. We didn't speak openly about the strange events so as not to spread panic, but our exchanged looks said enough. Something inexplicable was happening here. We resolved to cross this stretch of desert as quickly as possible and reach more populated roads. Yet throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into someone else's playground, and that someone was still watching us. We marched all day with hardly any stops, only brief pauses to let the cows drink some water. The herd was exhausted and the cowboys were worn out, but everyone wanted to cover as many miles as possible before the next camp. By evening, dark clouds began crawling along the horizon. It looked as though a sandstorm might hit. Yet the wind came in gusts that offered no relief from the oppressive heat. The air was thick and stifling, and no one knew whether the weather would turn to rain or simply bring another calamity. When the sun finally set, we set up camp by a small, dry riverbed where the ground was firmer and sparse bushes jutted out around us. We arranged the herd in a semicircle, keeping the horses and wagons near the center, and built more fires than usual. I ordered that 4 men be on guard at all times, with everyone else ready at a moment's notice. After the nighttime attacks, no one believed we could let our guard down. Around midnight, one of the cowboys noticed movement among the bushes, as if someone were sneaking around trying to circle the camp. We extinguished some of the fires so that in the darkness we could better see any shifting shadows. A chill ran down my spine when the dim moonlight revealed a vague silhouette, a creature moving swiftly, crouched low with elongated limbs and a head reminiscent of a wolf, but exuding a distinctly sinister energy. The cowboys opened fire, yet the beast, or rather the humanoid creature if you can call it that, dashed behind some rocks with a speed that far exceeded that of any ordinary animal. We set off after it, leaving a few men behind at the camp. Despite our sprinting as fast as we could, we eventually found nothing but darkness and emptiness. It seemed the creature had dissolved into the night silence. A few cowboys mentioned that they'd heard its roar somewhere ahead, but when we checked, there was no one there. Soon we turned back, for we couldn't leave the herd unguarded. On our return, I heard from afar the bellowing of cows and the barking of dogs. It appeared that while we were chasing that shadow, someone had attacked the herd from the other side. Rushing back to the camp, we found another bloody massacre. Several cows had been savagely torn apart. So brutally, in fact, that even pumas wouldn't inflict wounds so ragged. Aside from strange marks, resembling enormous claw and tooth imprints of an unusual shape, there were no further clues. The cowboy who remained on duty said he'd barely caught sight of a horrifying figure in the darkness. He shouted and raised the alarm with his shots, but the creature emitted a disgusting, guttural roar and then vanished behind the fires. No one could tell whether it was a man, an animal, or some monstrous hybrid. A cold sweat ran down my back at the thought that something so dangerous roamed these lands, and that we were powerless to drive it away with ordinary bullets. That night passed under the constant threat that the creature might return at any moment. The livestock panicked, and the men argued about whether we should continue at all, as our losses were mounting and everyone's morale was on the brink. Tom could barely speak, only shaking his head. But I knew that turning back was not an option. Behind us lay the desert and that cursed ritual circle, clearly linked to all this damn madness. We set up a round-the-clock watch and spent the rest of the night huddled by the fires, praying that nothing would return before dawn. When the first light appeared, everyone seemed shattered and pale. Deep down, I knew our nightmare was far from over. That unknown beast had left a harrowing impression on me, and even more so, some elusive intelligence seemed to guide its movements. I tried to keep my composure and inspire the others, but with every new loss, it grew harder. We had to at least cross this cursed area and reach a place where proper roads began, and where perhaps there were people who could help. The 8th day turned out to be surprisingly quiet. We covered most of the distance without incident, although everyone was exhausted from the night's battle. In the evening, I insisted that we continue for another hour or two in the twilight to minimize our time in these accursed lands. The men agreed the darkness was frightening, but staying put would only make us easy prey. Even the livestock seemed to sense the tension, obediently moving forward as if aware that we were hurrying to safety. Only when the horses' legs were nearly failing and the men were literally dozing in the saddle did I order a stop. We chose a wide, open plain, so there would be no hiding places for predators. That night, we arranged our guard so that the entire herd remained in sight. The cowboys barely built any large fires, only a few around the perimeter to allow our eyes to adjust to the darkness and to spot any enemy from afar. The hours dragged painfully by. At one point, I began to think we might get through the night unscathed, but around 4 a.m, something happened that still sends shivers down my spine. I first heard the agonized roar of the cows, and almost immediately, gunshots and screams erupted. I grabbed my rifle and raced toward the chaos. The faint twilight of the night sky barely illuminated the field, revealing a gruesome sight. Several creatures, resembling either giant wolves or bestial man-like figures, were tearing through the herd. Their silhouettes were warped, like hunchbacked figures cloaked in foul-smelling fur. The cowboys fired point blank, and it seemed the bullets found their mark. Roars burst forth from the creatures' maws, and some fell to their knees only to rise again, as if wounded but not fatally. I saw long limbs ending in powerful claws that tore into cows and ripped flesh apart. The smell of blood mingled with the suffocating stench of wet fur and something else indescribable, like sulfur mixed with rancid breath. I aimed at one of the creatures, pulled the trigger, and felt the recoil nearly knock my shoulder off. The creature shuddered, let out a howl, and lunged away, leaving a dark trail on the sand. From the side, another emerged, bearing yellow fangs, and leaped on one of the cowboys, knocking him to the ground. I ran closer, raised my rifle, and tried to shoot, but I hadn't reloaded in time. Another cowboy fired a bullet into its side, and the creature recoiled, releasing its victim. The dogs barked so furiously that it hurt your ears, yet most of them were too frightened to approach these beings, and I couldn't blame them. They too seemed to sense the horror we faced. The battle was chaotic. One of our hired hands suffered deep, gaping wounds in his chest, while 2 others were only lightly bitten. At last we managed to drive off the remaining creatures, which began to retreat once they realized we wouldn't be easy targets. They vanished into the darkness, leaving behind several dead cows and injured men. Afterward, we gathered the wounded and did our best to bandage their injuries. One cowboy died before dawn, apparently from severe blood loss. The sight of his body was monstrous. It looked as if he had been attacked by a genuine monster, not just a wild animal. By dawn, those still on their feet sat in silence by the cooling embers of the campfires, trying to recover. I could feel that everyone's nerves were at their breaking point, but retreat was not an option. We were too far in, and the herd had dwindled far below its original size. If we didn't reach our destination, we'd lose our profit and risk ending up empty-handed. Besides, our food and water would barely last a couple more days. All we could do was move forward, hoping we'd escape these territories of horrific creatures. The next morning was the hardest of the entire journey. We buried the cowboy who had succumbed to his wounds and discovered that one of our men had simply vanished. No one had seen when or how he left. Perhaps he couldn't bear the horror and fled under the cover of night. Or, more terrifyingly, he was taken by those creatures. I fought to keep my thoughts in check, lest despair overtake me. Gathering our strength, we drove the remaining livestock onward, quickening our pace. Our horses were exhausted too, but we had no other choice. The herd began moving more cohesively, as if the cows and bulls themselves sensed it was time to leave these cursed lands. In the latter part of the day, I saw the first signs of more civilized territory. A dusty road appeared on the distant horizon, along which a few sparse buildings could be seen. Relief filled my soul. Just a little further, and we would reach our destination where the buyer awaited. By evening, we finally arrived. The buyer had a spacious pen of his own, and I handed over what remained of the herd. I hastily explained that along the way, we had been attacked by a pack of unknown beasts resembling wolves, and we'd lost a great deal of cattle. The owner looked skeptical at first, but then he saw the unmistakable wounds, the patched-up hides of the surviving cows, and caught the smell. And eventually he decided not to argue. Apparently he too had heard whispers of strange happenings in those parts, even though no one officially confirmed them. Once the sale was settled, the local sheriff interrogated me. I told him exactly what I had seen. Horrifying creatures attacking us, leaving hideous marks, and perpetrating bloody massacres on both cows and men. The sheriff shook his head and said that in recent months there had been reports of missing travelers in that stretch of desert. He promised to assemble a posse to verify whether that ritual circle of stones and the pit leading to the cave truly existed. I volunteered to accompany him to show the location, though I had no desire to face that foul thing again. In the end, the sheriff, a couple of brave souls, and I returned there on horseback. We reached the stone circle on a clear day. Of course, there were no cows around, but as soon as we got closer, our horses began to snort and back away. I felt the same chill as the first time. We circled the stones and peered into the pit where the cow had fallen. Down below, the cave still yawned in darkness. Yet I saw no signs of life, only decay and stone walls receding into the depths. We found no traces of any creatures there, except for the gnawed bones of small animals. It felt as though the very earth was imbued with a cursed power. The locals, for their part, now avoided those lands all the more. They said that if a traveler went missing, he had most likely fallen prey to those werewolves or something even worse. After returning to calmer regions, I couldn't shake the memories of those horrors. We lost no fewer than 50 cows and several men were injured. Since that day, Tom has not uttered a word about what he saw deep in the cave. Sometimes at night I hear him startle, as if caught in a nightmare. Perhaps it's best not to know what lay hidden there. I decided to record this story in my diary so that anyone who reads it will understand. There are places in the desert where it's best not to tread. Sometimes we humans venture too confidently into lands that aren't ours, unaware of what dwells within. Life has taught me enough of those lessons, and now I steer clear of any territory where I have felt the breath of the subterranean darkness. Story 2. Now I'm well into my 20s, yet sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, recalling what happened when I was 14. Back then, I lived in a quiet rural town called Silver Creek. That place was famous for having almost no artificial light at night, so the stars shone brighter than anywhere else. My parents were always cautious. They wouldn't let me stay out late without a good reason, constantly reminding me that it was better to be home during the dark hours. But one day they finally gave me a chance for a little adventure. Truth be told, I had been pleading with them for a long time. The excuse was a meteor shower that my friend Logan had told me about. It was supposed to be visible around 3 in the morning and very bright. At that time, I already had a faithful companion, my black Labrador named Ranger. Yes, it's an odd name for a girl, but it suited her personality perfectly. When I was still very little, she once distinguished herself by chasing a wild rabbit. She pursued it so relentlessly that we had to forcibly stop her to prevent her from getting hurt. My parents then remarked, "Well, look at our little Ranger," and the name stuck. On that fateful day, I had been begging with all my might for permission to go out at night to a hill that offered a magnificent view of the starry sky. My parents hesitated for a long time, but eventually said, "If you take the dog with you, we're fine with it." I didn't object. I always felt safer with Ranger by my side. Besides, Ranger and I were already used to our nightly walks, and she always sported our signature crimson bandana around her neck. Why that particular bandana? That's a long story. But to put it briefly, I just liked its color, and Ranger would happily wag her tail when I tied the knot around her neck. But back to the point. The night turned out dark. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, yet the stars shone almost as brightly as I had expected. I went to bed early to gather strength, but true sleep eluded me. I was too excited about the impending event. At 14, every unusual opportunity feels like something grand, an experience of freedom and self-importance. Around 2:30 in the morning, I finally got up, washed up, and dressed in warmer clothes, all on tiptoe so as not to wake my parents. I took Ranger out into the yard, checked my flashlight, and grabbed my retractable leash. I remember well how that leash snapped in my hand as I adjusted the mechanism, probably the most mundane sound, which soon gave way to far more ominous ones. I intended to quickly go get Logan so that we could head to the hill together. To be honest, I was a little scared of going out completely alone, even with the dog. But I comforted myself with the thought, what's there to fear? It's quiet here. No crime. Nothing abnormal. How wrong I was. Even now, when I recall how that night began, a shiver runs down my spine. I never could have imagined how terrifying that supposedly safe journey toward the stars would turn out to be. When I stepped outside, complete darkness reigned all around. Only here and there did small lights flicker in the houses, perhaps from fellow stargazers or simply insomniacs. And overhead, the majestic canopy of stars stretched out. I was only 14 then, and I had no idea that this would be a night I would never forget. I walked along the fence, trying to tread quietly so as not to wake the neighbors. Ranger, with her crimson bandana around her neck, wagged her tail excitedly. For her, every outing was a little celebration, even if it was just a nighttime stroll. But that night, I felt an unusual vibration in the air, perhaps from the anticipation of the meteor shower, or maybe from the profound silence that enveloped our town. It seemed as if everything was holding its breath in expectation. Rounding the corner, I headed toward Logan's house. We went to the same school, sat in adjacent desks, and often came up with various pranks. He was the one who initiated this nighttime expedition. He had read somewhere in a magazine about a special meteor shower. "Ethan, check it out. The peak will be at 3 in the morning. We have to see it," he had insisted during the day. But when I reached his house and quietly knocked on the window, his response wasn't very enthusiastic. Logan looked uneasy and somewhat embarrassed. "Sorry, Ethan. I'm insanely tired. I probably shouldn't go. I know I promised, but let's talk about it tomorrow." I wasn't sure if he was joking or serious. In the end, I sighed in irritation and said, "All right, fine. See you in the morning then." Need I say that I was a bit angry? But going back home empty-handed? No way. I wasn't about to let the opportunity slip, so I decided to go to the hill by myself. Well, not entirely by myself. I had Ranger with me. I thought maybe it's for the best. Tranquility, stars, and complete freedom. I turned on my flashlight and checked the leash. A regular one wouldn't have been a problem, but the retractable leash always allowed Ranger more freedom of movement. I kept in mind that in the dark she might get excited if she caught the scent of some creature. Who knows what might be scurrying through the fields at night. Not that I was scared. Our town was small, with hardly any crime, and the rural surroundings exuded a familiar pastoral calm for miles. But this time, something strange hung in the air. Perhaps it was just the usual sense of unease you get when you walk at night and imagine every shadow is a predator or a thief. Yet inside, an inner voice grew louder, whispering, "Turn around, look around. Notice how the darkness is too thick." Trying to push those thoughts aside, I quickened my pace. The trail to the hill took no more than half an hour at a normal walk along the fields. I didn't even consider the short route through the cornfield. One could get lost there even during the day, and at night even more so. Besides, my parents had repeatedly warned me, "Don't go in there by yourself." I believed them, yet every time I secretly wondered, what if I had taken the risk? Above me, the chilling cries of nocturnal birds echoed and owls hooted in the distance. I brought my phone up to my eyes. It was almost 3, meaning the meteor shower should be starting any minute. The thought flashed through my head, hurry up and get to the top. But little did I know that the path to the hill would turn out not to be a quiet stroll, but a road leading to an encounter with a genuine nightmarish horror. Ranger and I walked along the edge of the field, sticking to the familiar trail. Around us stretched an endless darkness, and only my flashlight carved out a faint circle of light. The stars above shone like a scattering of precious gems on black velvet. Under other circumstances, I would have marveled at such sights and pondered eternity. But now I felt tense. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath in vigilance. The first unusual detail was the presence of strange depressions in the ground. They were small, like the footprints of tiny animals, yet there were too many of them, arranged in chaotic patterns. When I knelt down to shine my flashlight into one of these holes, it appeared as if there were traces of claws inside. Perhaps moles or rats had dug these burrows, I thought, but why were they so close together and in such abundance? Seeing these holes, Ranger began to get nervous. She would sniff them, whine plaintively, and sometimes let out a quiet growl toward the cornfield. With a sigh, I adjusted her bandana and said, "Calm down, girl." But she wouldn't settle, as if she sensed that something ominous lurked in the darkness. The further we went, the more distinct the feeling grew that someone was watching us. The wind stirred the tall corn stalks, creating the impression of footsteps or scraping movements. A couple of times I thought I heard the crackle of branches or a rustle, but when I aimed my flashlight, I saw only empty rows of plants disappearing into the gloom. The corn seemed incredibly tall and dense, like an impenetrable wall that concealed its secrets. When I reached a fork, where I had to either continue skirting around the field or cut across a narrower path by the thickets, I decided to stick to the plan: avoid dead ends. The thought ran through my head, better not risk it. But the inner voice teased, "It's almost 3. You'll miss the best part." I glanced at my watch uncertainly. There were only a few minutes left until the expected start of the meteor shower. Honestly, a slight panic overcame me. I didn't want to be late. Then, quite suddenly, Ranger bit down on her leash, wagged her tail, and tugged me forward. I might have attributed it to typical canine excitement, but there was genuine anxiety in her eyes. I don't like to exaggerate, but it seemed to me that she was trying to warn me about something. We moved on, taking a detour yet trying to pick up the pace. The sky above lightened a bit and a few stars fell, leaving quick glowing streaks across the heavens. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Normally, a shooting star inspires awe, but now a strange unease stirred within me, as if it were a signal of something sinister. After a while, I glanced toward the field for a moment, and it seemed to me that a tall shadow was moving between the rows of corn. I wasn't even sure if it was a person or an animal. The silhouette was too unnatural. My heart clenched into a knot. "Don't go there!" it screamed inside. And yet I was closer than ever to my destination, and I couldn't just turn back and forgo the long-awaited meteor shower. That's how I tried to reassure myself, unaware that the real danger lay ahead. Barely had I taken a few steps after another turn when my foot caught on one of those little mounds of earth. I tumbled forward and my flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled straight into one of the holes. At that moment, the silence was shattered by a nightmarish sound, a muffled growl that turned into a piercing, almost hysterical laugh. I froze, as if struck by lightning. "Ranger," I whispered, trying to feel for the leash, but it wasn't in my hand. It had jerked free and flown away when I fell. Barely had I lifted my eyes when I saw the dog darting toward the corn stalks, disappearing into the gloom. I had to scramble after her to catch up, or else she would have been lost altogether. My heart pounded like crazy. What's out there in the dark? And then I saw it. In the pale light of the stars, a figure appeared, twice my height, perhaps even over 2 meters tall. I couldn't make out the details, but I noticed dark, rough fur and long limbs ending in claws. The creature stood in a tense pose, as if preparing to leap, and emitted a low growl that froze the blood in my veins. It seemed its eyes flickered with a sinister flame, and its face, or rather its snout, was twisted in an incomprehensible grimace. A mix of animalistic aggression and almost human malice. I instinctively tried to locate my flashlight, but in the pitch darkness it was useless. Suddenly, the creature approached and grabbed the retractable leash lying on the ground, the same one I used with Ranger. Its claws scraped along the plastic with a harsh sound. It seemed to be examining the object, as if understanding its purpose. My breath caught in my throat. Had I not been so terrified, I would have screamed, but my voice was stuck. Then something I never expected happened. The creature uttered sounds that resembled speech. But it wasn't English, nor was it the Spanish I'd heard from the farm workers. It was some kind of rough, hissing language, a blend of growling and ancient words. Each word sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a wave of chilling terror wash over me. This meant that before me was not merely a wild animal, but something that possessed the rudiments of intelligence. Suddenly, it flung the leash aside, turned, and disappeared among the tall stalks, moving with unimaginable speed and grace. I couldn't believe my eyes, so fast and so silent. Only a barely audible rustle betrayed its direction. From behind, I heard Ranger emit a soft growl. She clearly sensed the intruder even more keenly than I did. Once I regained my composure, I got up on shaky legs, grabbed the retractable leash, and looked around. No one was in sight, but I had no doubt. It was somewhere nearby, watching me from behind the thick foliage. In another second, a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I didn't know what to do. Run away or stay? It seemed that any move I made would be the wrong one. Then something rustled again, as if claws were scraping the ground. From somewhere to the side came that same laugh growl. My heart seemed about to burst out of my chest. I had to leave immediately, but the road to the hill ran right into the depths of the field. Where could I run? As if in answer to my questions, Ranger whimpered softly and suddenly tugged me back in the direction we had come. I understood. She wanted to escape, and I didn't contradict her. Ranger and I dashed along a narrow path lit so weakly by the moonlight that the shapes ahead were barely discernible. I held onto the retractable leash, making sure not to let go. If I lost the dog, I would be alone in the darkness. Ranger was running so fast that I could barely keep up with her. A couple of times I nearly fell, tangling myself in protruding roots and stones. At the same time, I had a crushing sense that we were not alone. An unknown creature was trailing us like a shadow, as if playing, testing our reaction. I heard its presence from either side, barely discernible footsteps, the snap of twigs, and sometimes a growl drowned out by my own ragged breathing. Once I even felt something or someone abruptly grab the hood of my jacket. I lunged forward desperately, breaking free of that grasp and leaving behind a frighteningly torn piece of fabric. At that moment, that hoarse half-laugh echoed in the darkness again, sending shivers down my spine. It was clearly not a human sound. As if confirming my worst fears, the creature appeared several times in the distance in the dim beam of moonlight. Its silhouette would crouch, as if preparing to leap, then vanish into the dark thickets, circling us in an arc. It seemed as if it could have attacked directly, but instead it kept driving us deeper into the labyrinth of the fields. After a while, I realized with horror that we had lost the familiar path and were apparently heading in the wrong direction. In a panic, I tried several times to check my phone, but my hands were trembling and the screen displayed only a low battery and a useless screensaver. There was hardly any signal. I cursed under my breath and kept running. Ranger seemed to sense the way, but even she was beginning to get nervous. At one of the turns, she jerked more sharply than usual, and her crimson bandana got caught on a protruding branch. The fabric strained, the dog whimpered, and she stopped trying to free herself. "Damn it!" I exclaimed. I halted, even though every part of me screamed, "Don't stop, run!" But I couldn't abandon Ranger. I had to literally untie the knot to pull her free. The bandana stayed caught on the branch. Barely had I taken a step when that same eerie laugh echoed from above, as if the creature were mocking us. I looked up and saw its figure just a few meters away. Its eyes glowed with a reddish gleam. It seemed as if it had taken control of the entire space, and we were nothing but victims, running in a predetermined circle. For a moment I was paralyzed, but then I grabbed Ranger again and ran away. The creature did not hurry to catch up with us. It continued to appear and disappear among the stalks. When I was beginning to lose hope, a faint light flashed in the distance. It turned out we had unexpectedly emerged onto a country road, though it wasn't the one we had started on. Staggering from exhaustion and fear, I found the strength to urge the dog to keep running. Even though I wasn't sure how far we were from the residential streets, I knew that in the open I would at least have a chance to call for help. After a few minutes of frantic running, I recognized the familiar outlines of our suburban quarter. My heart pounded so loudly I could almost hear it in my ears. The creature was still behind us, but not nearly as close anymore. Its presence was felt more like a sliding gaze from the dark corners of the field. When the houses grew brighter, I was completely spent, almost collapsing from exhaustion. I hoped that this nocturnal creature wouldn't dare approach the glowing streetlights. But that was only hope. Once we were under the light of the nearest street lamp, I literally collapsed to my knees. Ranger, too, looked exhausted. She was breathing heavily, yet her tail remained warily held high. I glanced toward the fields. Beyond lay an impenetrable darkness. It was as if the night itself was staring at me with empty eyes from that void, and still the creature did not appear. I no longer knew whether to rejoice or be afraid, for it could be hiding anywhere in the dark. As soon as I realized that we were, at least conditionally, safe, I immediately remembered my parents. They must be going crazy with worry, I thought. Yes, despite all my pleading, their permission only lasted until sunrise, and only on the condition that everything remained calm. I trudged home, my legs weak and my breathing uneven. The door was unlocked. My mother and father were apparently waiting for me. My mother immediately bombarded me with questions. "Where have you been? Why did it take so long? I heard strange knocks at the door. Ranger ran out into the yard and then disappeared. I was so worried." My father, frowning, stood behind me, ready to scold me. But seeing my condition, he simply asked, "What happened?" I opened my mouth to speak, but realizing the absurdity of my words, I fell silent. How could I possibly explain about a gigantic, furry monster speaking in an unknown language? Yet I didn't want to remain silent either. There was something terrifying out there. A huge creature, I began haltingly. My parents exchanged worried glances. Finally, my mother said softly, "Calm down, take a shower, and go to bed. We'll talk about it in the morning." I was grateful to her for that. I simply didn't have the strength to explain the details. Later, just before going to sleep, I noticed that Ranger had that very same crimson bandana around her neck again, even though I was certain it was supposed to have stayed in the field where I had torn it trying to free her. I stared at the bandana, trying to find any sign of a tear. But it looked intact, only slightly damp, as if it had been brought from somewhere. A chill ran through me. Who could have returned it? And most importantly, why? The next morning, I woke to the bright sun streaming through the window and a splitting headache. The night before seemed like an insane nightmare, but as soon as I glanced at my dirty boots in the hallway and my scratched jacket, I realized it had all really happened. My mother cautiously asked, "Are you sure you're okay?" I nodded, though inside I still feared that the creature might be nearby. Even during the day, I listened intently for every rustle outside the window. Years have passed since then, and I now live in another place, but nightmares still haunt me. In them, I run once again through a dark field, while behind me I hear the repulsive scraping of claws and that sinister laugh. They say in legends that werewolves and demonic creatures exist, and I'm no longer sure that all those stories are mere fiction. For in one horrifying night I witnessed something that defies simple logic. Perhaps there are things that have no place in the daylight, yet they still exist. And if you ever find yourself alone in the middle of nowhere at night, far from prying eyes, remember, you can never be sure who or what might be lurking in the darkness.